Matthew 7. We are continuing our study in these two sets of groups and these warnings. If you would stand, and we'll begin in verse 15 of Matthew 7. Watch out for false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ferocious wolves. You will recognize them by their fruit. Grapes are not gathered from thorns, or figs from thistles, are they? In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree is not able to bear bad fruit, nor a bad tree to bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then you will recognize them by their fruit. A group of elite zoology students from Harvard University had a plan to foil their professor. And their professor happened to be one of the most famous zoology professors in American history, if not the most published, Dr. Agassiz, who had a long tenured career in zoology at Harvard University. And so on this particular day, the students wanted to pull a prank on their professor to see if they could be the first to foil him in his illustrious career. What they did is they took 24 different insects, dissected them, and took various body parts from the 24 insects and meticulously glued them together to form one mongrel bug, to see if Dr. Agassiz could be stumped. They made it out when they presented the bug to their professor that they had discovered some undocumented species and were very thrilled, but they had to put on a face so as not to laugh out loud as he was inspecting the bug. He looked it up, he looked it down, he took the microscope to it. Minutes elapsed, and all the students with bated breath and gritted teeth, because they didn't want to laugh out loud and expose their joke, and they were convinced that they had stumped him. Finally, he said, "I have discovered what kind of bug this is." And they all waited to say, "The joke's on you." And he said, "This bug is a humbug." And Dr. Agassiz's illustrious career remained intact. He could not be stumped. I wish I could say that humbugs only existed in the world of insects, but humbugs exist in the world of Christianity as well. They are not insects crawling about on their legs and antennas. They come, as we see today, with masks of deception, known as false teachers. And we, of course, as what Jesus is articulating in the text at hand, is arguing for spiritual Agassiz, for men and women, boys and girls of Jesus, to be able to spot counterfeits. Because not only have they come, but as if our text is quite clear, they're here and they're coming to the Christian world. And so Jesus, in our text today, our second of our warnings at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, gives us who we're to spot, and more importantly, the emphasis is how we're to do it. How are you and I to spot a spiritual huckster? How are you and I to see clearly of who the humbugs that, as Jesus says here, come within the church? So here, right out of the gate, in verse 15, Jesus gives a word, Matthew actually uses it, like a blinking neon light to arrest attention. And Matthew, if you haven't picked up on now, will use certain terms that Mark, Luke, and John do not use. And a lot of that is because he's Jewish and he's writing predominantly to a Jewish audience about Jesus being the King of the Jews. And so even here, his use of the word beware. When Matthew uses this, it is used exclusively in his gospel to refer to people with spiritual defects. It is used for hypocrites or false teachers exclusively in Matthew's gospel. So when Matthew uses it, it's like a warning light on your engine. When Matthew uses it, it's like being a cashier at a grocery store. You've got to be on guard of what counterfeit bills look like. It's like being a truck driver late at night. You can't fall asleep at the wheel, so you need to pay attention. That's what this word connotes, a sense of watchfulness, of vigilance. It's much like last week's. But pay attention or you'll miss it. Now, if you are a parent of a young child in this room and you have a new neighbor who moves in, let's say 2 doors down, and you meet this new neighbor and welcome them to the neighborhood, and you find that this neighbor is congenial and this neighbor is gentlemanly and this neighbor they dialogue with you, they just seem nice. And a few weeks later, you find that they are on the sex offender list of the state of Kansas. And you look at their rap sheet that's a mile long, and they are many in cases of sexual predators. So when you let your kids out the backyard or let them go play in the street football, there's a sense of watchfulness now that you know what lingers. There's a sense of vigilance that you're just not going to be careless. You're going to be on guard. That's the same emotion into this verse where Jesus is saying to his followers, look, danger looms. They're not out there somewhere. They've come in. And you better be watchful because their job is to destroy. Their job is to decimate the church. And so you have to be on guard. And if you're careless and you're lazy and you're sleepy, you'll miss it and damage will come. So that's the warning. Beware. It's much like our previous warning of enter. Last week we saw this. Well, who are we to watch out for? Jesus tells us in verse 15, doesn't he? False prophets. Now, when Scripture describes someone who is hostile to Jesus and everything that Jesus presents, Scripture puts people into generally 3 categories. There is the heretic, there is the apostate, and there is the false teacher. A heretic, at least by New Testament definition, not what you see on Facebook, because apparently everyone's a heretic today with some groups. But according to the New Testament, a heretic is someone who openly and publicly rejects Jesus and anything associated with him, and tries to convince others to do the same. An apostate is someone who once upon a time held to a belief system about Jesus' claims, but recently has rejected that, and they have openly denied Jesus and his associates and everything he believes, and they're trying to convince others to do the same. I have a friend like that, a self-professed atheist. So like Muslims and atheists would be heretics, for example. And I have a friend who is an atheist, and for years he's been trying to get me to come work for his Fortune 500 company as a motivational speaker. Every time he sees me, he says, "Are you still preaching that mumbo jumbo?" That's what he calls Christianity. He says, he said, "I'll hire you on the spot, 6-figure salary, you'll be touring the United States." So he's actually trying to proselyte me. That's what a heretic is. They openly reject the gospel and are trying to convince others to do the same. And in this sense, a heretic and an apostate have a common link in that they're public. They're open. You know where they stand. They've shown their cards. A false teacher, while they also reject Jesus and his claims and his associates, they are different than a heretic or apostate in terms of method. Theirs is more covert. Theirs is more deceptive. They lie in wait and insulate themselves, and they are the spiritual AIs. They look like the real thing, they talk like the real thing, but they are hucksters. And they make a point to be sort of saboteurs, come in the body and then lie in wait. And so how do they disguise? I've already mentioned it. First, they sound or talk like the real thing. Now, Matthew shows here and throughout his gospel his Jewish influence. He really brings in the Old Testament in so many stories, and he does it here. In the Old Testament, there were a lot of prophets. And in the Old Testament, there are at least 2, 3 maybe, common links of being a true prophet of God. The first is that God called you. You didn't call him. God appointed you to be a prophet, and thus a prophet, a true prophet, has been commissioned by God to speak for him. So to the degree the prophets spoke in the Old Testament, God did. Now, the people of God didn't always like it. They usually didn't like what they heard when, you typically didn't want a prophet coming to your town. It was going to be bad news, probably. But sure as a world, a true prophet of God spoke for God. And Matthew, quite interestingly, adds another characteristic that shows his Jewish flair. Every time in Matthew's gospel, and I've provided it for you in your notes, every time when Matthew mentions a true prophet, he always connects true righteousness to that prophet. So that a true prophet of God is always a righteous man. This is big for Matthew and big in the Old Testament. Unrighteousness in the Old Testament means you didn't obey Yahweh. You didn't listen to his words. And so Matthew's big in the Sermon on the Mount on make sure your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, and seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. So in Matthew's gospel, a true prophet is a righteous person. Well, a false prophet, by definition, if we were being literal, is someone who speaks for God falsely. But that's not quite clear. A false teacher or a false prophet is someone who claims to speak for God, but God has never commissioned that person to do so. And a second, and Matthew brings this out, a false prophet is someone who claims to speak for God that God never endorsed, but also a false teacher's message is always giving the people of God a false sense of security, a false hope, false promises. So a couple of examples here. If you've ever studied the prophet Jeremiah and his ministry to Judah, it's a lofty book. This comes up in different places. The first time it comes up in Jeremiah's prophecy is when the land of Judah is exposed by the prophet for their rejection of his word. Literally, Jeremiah says to Judah, "You have despised the word of God." And no sooner did Jeremiah give that prophecy that false teachers come and they say to Judah, "It will be well with you." So the false teachers say, yeah, you've disobeyed God, but it's okay. You're going to be fine. God's going to take care of you. So it's a false sense of security. Later on in Jeremiah mentions another message of God. And there he condemns people who have stubbornly followed their own heart and not obeyed God's word. And sure as a world, the false teachers come around again, and this is their message to Judah: no evil will come on you. So the false teachers see Judah openly despising the word of God, and they say, you're good. God knows your heart. Doesn't matter what you believe. He knows you're sincere. I mean, this one could have been written yesterday. And then there's a third occurrence where after God judges Judah and it's total chaos and tumult, the false teachers come again and they say, peace, peace, when there is no peace. And this is beyond just Jeremiah, if you've ever read the Kings, 1 Kings, and you read about a king by the name of Ahab, who's the ruler of Israel, and he's partnering with Jehoshaphat. How would you like to name your kid that? Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, and they're going to ally to go into battle against the Assyrians. And there's one prophet by the name of Micaiah who approaches Ahab and says, look, you go out to battle, you're going to be killed by a messenger of God that shoots an arrow, he does, and no one knows who shot it. If you've read that story, it's quite provocative. An arrow sent from God, no one knows who shot it, but it hit the mark. And Micaiah says, you go out, Ahab, you're going to die. And what does Ahab do? He doesn't like the word of the Lord, so he throws Micaiah into prison, and he actually asked this, is there not a prophet of God besides him that can tell me good things? And guess what? His wish is their command. Hundreds of false teachers come and they tell Ahab what he wants to hear. Go out, you'll be victorious, you'll prosper, you'll have a long life. And he goes out and he dies. So false teachers in the Old Testament do not speak for God like they claim, and they always give God's people a false sense of security. If you make your way back into Matthew employs each of these qualities for a false teacher, each of these elements. A false teacher is a bogus proclaimer. Later on, in this same section, just a few verses later, we have the exposure that false teachers are judged because they claim to speak for Jesus, but Jesus never gave them that authority. Verse 21, many will say to me, and I believe that's false teachers, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And did we not cast out demons in your name? And did we not do many powerful deeds in your name? This is actually verse 22. And Jesus is a little miffed with this, as we would be. I mean, if you're like me and you've ever had someone go to someone else and use my name as an authority, you know, they'll say, well, Pastor Brian said that when I didn't say this at all. I didn't tell you to say that. I get a little miffed with that. Who do you think you are? And Jesus is miffed. Who told you to go use my name? I never gave you that authority. And it's kind of comical if it wasn't so sad. They're actually trying to convince Jesus to let them in the kingdom on the basis that they've exploited his name and done something he didn't tell them to do. And what is his edict? I don't know you. Who are you talking to? I never gave you that authority. So in Matthew we see this. We also see that in Matthew, false teachers give the people of God a false sense of security and a false hope. Remember, back in chapter 3 when John the Baptist, the first sermon preached? Remember who he excoriated? These same hucksters, who I believe was the religious establishment of Israel. More of that in a moment. And the religious establishment come out to Israel, and John lamblasts them. And he lamblasts them, why? Because they are convinced, because they're Abraham's children, they're gold. That's what he said. Don't even think for a moment, because you say you're Abraham's children, that God's going to take you into the kingdom. You're fruitless vines, ready to be chopped down. And what they're thinking and convincing others later in the gospel is, look, our pedigree, our DNA is from Abraham. We are set just because we're born a Jew. And this is to give Israel a false sense of hope. This is not the way you brought into the kingdom. Later on in chapter 5, they give, their deviant religion gives people a false sense of hope, because what do they say? Look, we're truly righteous. Why? Because we do not commit homicide, because we do not commit adultery with another woman, because we adhere to religious oaths. In chapter 5, remember this? And Jesus saying, no. You got a heart problem. You may never commit homicide, but you got anger in your heart toward another brother. You may never commit adultery with another woman, but you lust after her all the time. You may not break religious oaths, but you can keep your word every day. Your heart is bad. This is the problem. And so they're giving people a false sense of security, because we don't do this and don't do this, therefore we're righteous. And this all crescendos into chapter 23, where Matthew says, "Woe to you, experts in the law, you Pharisees, you hypocrites, because you keep locking people out of the kingdom of heaven, for neither you enter, nor do you allow others trying to enter to go in." This is a reprisal of last week's sermon. So if you can imagine what Jesus is saying, these false hucksters are at the narrow gate blockading it, saying, no, you don't want to get in this way. Look at the wide gate. Look at all the people. They must be doing something right. It's easy. It's smooth. Go there. This is exactly what Jesus is saying that these religious false teachers do. They give people a false sense of security. So they talk like the real thing, but they also look like the real thing. Back to our text. Jesus says that these false teachers are the very ones who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ferocious wolves. A little back to hogs and dogs now, aren't we? Now, I actually have met a wolf in real life when I went up to the Boundary Waters for a week. They're a beautiful creature, but probably my experience and your experience is from videos and television. And wolves are, by instinct, killers. They do not know how to kill humanely, right? There's no genteel sort of just go off to sleep, little sheep, and you just won't wake up. None of that. When a wolf goes after their prey, they're eaters. I mean, your dog is a member of the wolf family. You give your dog a luscious buffet, and 2 minutes later, they act like they've never eaten before, right? They're killer. This is what they do. And wolves, when they go after their prey, their eyes roll back, they show their fangs, they growl at other wolves. It is not a pleasant experience. Flesh is ripped from its sinews, bones crack, blood splatters everywhere. They know one word, and that is to destroy, to ravage. And Jesus uses this imagery for a false teacher by saying when a wolf comes into the sheepfold, they don't say, "Little sheep, I'm a wolf, I'm here to kill you. See my claws, see my fangs." They don't do this. Rather, they're so dangerous, false teachers, that they come in the flock posing as a sheep. And what are sheep? My grandfather used to raise sheep. Sheep are the most gentle animal of the animal kingdom. They don't have fangs. They don't shoot venom. They don't shoot, porcupine quills. They don't hiss. They don't claw. They don't bite. They don't fly away. They don't have a hard shell. They are harmless and gentle, unless you get a ram when you're trying to de-wool it, as I found out once. And here these ferocious, ravenous wolves are passing as gentle sheep. They're coming in the flock. And every time Matthew uses the word sheep, it's that of God's people, Christ followers. I'll often hear that from time to time. I've been a pastor this year now. I just celebrated in August my 30th year as an ordained pastor, and next week my 21st year with you, right? So seen a lot, and I know on occasion it will happen. It's happened here where someone will come in the church, and before long I get a sense of what they're doing, that this is not healthy for the body, that actually they're trying to be divisive and destructive and sow discord. And basically anybody or anything that seeks to harm sheep is a bad thing. And I look back at that scenario, and some of you have said the same thing. Man, they seemed so harmless. They had a great sense of humor. They just seemed very gentle. That's by design. No one is going to come and say, hey, I'm a false teacher. I've come to destroy the body. I've come to decimate unity. They don't do that. This is not how Satan, who's an angel of light, works. They look like the real thing. And this is exactly what Matthew describes these people, these hucksters, with this. He does this outward-inward parallelism throughout his gospel. So in chapter 6, for example, the religious hucksters, they give, they pray, they fast. Outwardly, it looks good, but inwardly, they're deceptive because they're just doing it to be applauded by men. It doesn't matter. Later in chapter 23, Jesus will say, woe to you, experts in the law, hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs that look beautiful on the outside, but inside you're full of dead men's bones and everything else unclean. That's the Old Testament definition of a false teacher. In the same way, on the outside, you look like righteous people, but inside you're full of hypocrisy, and there's our word again, lawlessness. So false teachers are dangerous because they look and they sound like the real thing. I had a friend, decades ago now, who was out around her house just a little bit before now, in October. It was on a Saturday in the afternoon, a beautiful day. And she was out and she decided to do some fall cleanup around her house. And she got down on her hands and knees and was picking the leaves out from her mulch around her house. And there was a copperhead inches away from her that she never spotted. And that copperhead struck her. And with such force and with such venom that my friend Judy, for years later, had nerve damage. And a year later, she still had swelling in her wrist where she was struck by this copperhead. And she told me later, she said, Brian, I never saw it. I never saw it coming. It never moved. It was perfectly camouflaged among the mulch and the leaves. But boy, when it hit me, I knew what had happened. And this is a false teacher. And so what Jesus is saying in the remainder of the passage is the main thing. How do we avoid getting struck by a snake when we're tending flowers? Or there's an old farming proverb that a blind dog will never spot a bad thief. So how can we avoid being blind dogs? so that bad thieves don't enter in and destroy what God has done at Calvary or in Christianity, as it's happening all over the place? The answer to that question comes by one word that is mentioned 6 times in verses 16 through 19. It is the main point of this sermon, and that is the word fruit. And just so there's no unclarity, Jesus wraps around verses 16 and 19 with this exhortation, "You will know them by their fruit." Fruit never lies. Fruit will expose. And if there's any confusion about wolves dressed as sheep, which is meant to fool us, there is no confusion about a certain fruit growing on a tree. Everyone can spot that. So Jesus is saying to his followers, false teachers are coming, and they're going to infiltrate. Notice the language. They're coming in. They're false teachers. They're disguised as wolves to enter in the sheepfold. And while that may all stump us, what never will is they will show their cards by their conduct, by their behavior, by their fruit. So let's look at this for a few moments. And by the way, this is a big deal in the Bible. God used several metaphors in his relationship with his people. He might use shepherd and sheep. He might use building and cornerstone. He might use bride and groom. But he will often call his people my garden, my vineyard, my orchard. And he does that to Israel. So they understand their purpose. Israel's purpose is to bear good fruit so that all the other nations come and are nourished in God's orchard. He says that. Here's one passage. This is Ezekiel chapter 17, verse 8. Israel has been planted in good soil by abundant water so that she would produce branches and bear good fruit and become a splendid vine. That is the purpose of Israel in the Old Testament. To bear good fruit, a splendid orchard so that people come and are nourished by it. But by the time that Matthew is writing his gospel, we get corrupt fruit, particularly from the religious establishment. First, they relied too much on their national identity. This is chapter 3. And when they do, what does John the Baptist say? He says there is an axe coming to chop down a fruitless tree and throw it into the fire. A bad fruit is worthless. And interestingly enough, Jesus takes the same sermon of John and preaches it again in Matthew 12, only he adds one additional comment. He says the same thing about bad fruit, corrupt fruit, needing to be chopped down, but he adds one thing when addressing the religious establishment. He says, you all are aligned with Satan. That's why you're bearing bad fruit. And then, of course, if you've ever read Matthew through, you know this famous story in chapter 21 with Jesus cursing the fig tree. He walks in to Jerusalem. He sees a fig tree during harvest season bearing no figs, and he curses it. And the next day it's shriveled. And the disciples are confounded and they want to know what the lesson is. And he says, that's Israel. That's symbolic of Israel. And in Matthew's timing, he then walks into Jerusalem for the last time. It's the final week of Jesus when he curses this fig tree. And the very next story of cursing the fig tree, what does Jesus do? He says, oh, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and rejects those that I send to her. Jesus is staring at an entire religious system that has gone fruitless and barren and sterile, and it needs to be uprooted. And Jesus is planting a whole new orchard in his people that, what does he say in John? I have chosen you so that you go bear much fruit. That's the design by our Lord. But here, what Jesus does, the remaining of our story, is he talks about the good fruit, the fruit of the vine, or the fruit of the root. Fruit will always tell the root, in terms of its kind and its quality. First, the kind of fruit. This is the rhetorical question in verse 16, where Jesus says, a bramble of thistles will never bear grapes, will it? And a thicket of thistles will never bear figs, will it? And of course, the obvious answer is, of course not. Because the kind of fruit demonstrates the kind of tree. So let's suppose for a moment that Dan and I are both woodsmen. And Dan's, he's a well-traveled guy, handsome guy, very fashionable, very well-styled. And he says, look, I've been around. And we go out here and he says, that is a pear tree. And I laugh at Dan and say, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I grew up in Missouri. That clearly is an apple tree. I know this. And Dan says, no, Pastor, you know most things, but not this. I know a little bit better than you. This is a pear tree. And I say, no, it's an apple. And we begin to get into a little skiff. And it boils over, and Dan's mad. You're a very stubborn jerk, Pastor. And I call Dan, well, you're incompetent. You don't know what you're talking about. And we get other people involved, and now we don't even talk to each other because Dan thinks it's a pear tree, and I think it's an apple tree. Well, what is the greatest way to verify who's right in this situation? You wait for harvest. Right? And you go out there and knowing our luck, it's a persimmon tree, but you go out there and you look and you see the fruit. Fruit verifies the root. That's what all Jesus is saying. The kind of fruit shows you the kind of tree it is. Fruit never can be disguised. And the second is not only the kind of fruit, but the quality. That only a good tree will bear good fruit. A bad tree, corrupt, decayed, will never bear bad fruit. Those of you that are gardeners in this room, we probably said goodbye to our tomato plants last night. I did my best to salvage all my tomatoes yesterday because I knew what was coming. And sure enough, before I came up to church for a meeting this morning, I looked out and my vines were gone, right? They're just dead because of this heavy frost. Well, I'm not going to go back a week later to my tomato vines and believe that they're going to give me healthy tomatoes. It's not going to happen. I can do an Indian rain dance over it. I can pray to the Almighty. I can hope. I can do it. It's not going to happen. A bad vine cannot give good fruit. And this is what Jesus is saying, is fruit never deceives. So on this issue of false teachers, look at the conduct of their lives. Look at their behavior, and you'll see their heart. The church has always confronted this problem. In every era, there are hucksters. And there are hucksters alive and well in our era. I am shocked of the things that they say, but I am more shocked of the thousands of people that go to their churches, which are churches in name only. I am shocked of the television ministry and the influence and the books that they have. I'm thinking, would you go to this? And apparently they do. So this is nothing new. The Church of Jesus Christ, even in the New Testament day, had a big false teaching heresy that infiltrated the church, known as Gnosticism. I won't bore you with all that. It goes into the 2nd century and even to the 3rd. And the church nearly lost themselves in it. And during this time in the 2nd century, there was a young buck who was very well spoken. He was a preacher's kid. His name was Marcion. And Marcion has the distinct honor of being excommunicated by 2 churches. his dad's church, who excommunicated him, and then the Church of Rome. So Marcion, when he's excommunicated, goes to Rome, and he is very well spoken. He knows the Bible. He's a Sunday school teacher, and he trains other Sunday school teachers. They wouldn't call it Sunday school, but I'm calling it Sunday school. He's a great writer. He is a man of great influence. He is wealthy, very wealthy. He paid for his membership in the Church of Rome without any papers, which was basically he paid for what would be equivalent to $1 million. I guarantee you a lot of pastors, if a guy threw $1 million at him, would say, okay, you can be a member of my church. That's exactly what happened to Marcion. He did not have papers because he was excommunicated, so he wouldn't serve the papers. So he said, well, here's a little, so he bribes the church. He is very sexually corrupt. He has a relationship with an underage girl, gets her pregnant and abandons her, all while teaching the Bible. And his theology is very suspect, but it's his conduct, his seeking to cause dissension and corruption of the Church of Rome, and he was quite successful for a while. And the church, to deal with him, employed a method known as the truth-life test. And that is, they got it from Matthew 7. It's mentioned in the Didache. And their thinking was, look, it doesn't matter what a man says. The devil's pretty good theologians. And by the way, anecdotally, I would say that the worst enemies I've ever met are not pagans. They're people in the church that know enough of the Bible but are corrupt in heart to do serious damage to the people of God, by far, in my experience. And the church employed this method, and they said, we have to look at the man's conduct. And if the man's conduct does not line up to the Scriptures, it doesn't matter what he says in terms of orthodoxy. He's corrupt. If he's seeking to destroy the church, if he's seeking to corrupt the church's unity, which is sacrosanct, and is exactly what the gospel of peace does, is bring people together. If he's seeking to divide that, this is a problem. Well, the truth life method worked, and it still works. It still works today, where Jesus says our fruit matters. And apparently this is a big deal because in the New Testament books, the apostles write about false teaching. Peter addresses it, John addresses it, as does Paul. And Paul in Galatians will talk about the fruits of the flesh versus the fruits of the Spirit. And you always know you have a Spirit-filled church, a Spirit-filled teacher, when these fruits are manifest. Not perfect, but manifest. And so, Calvary, as we protect ourselves by being men and women, boys and girls, armed to the gospel, living out righteous lives. Jesus Christ died for us. He rose from the dead, and there's a moment in his ministry where he asked the same religious establishment that's present here, which one of you convicts me of sin? Which one of you can make a charge that I have erred in any way? And they answered him not a word. And so we are to remain holy as he is holy, and this pure gospel that is to be guarded and to be lived.